This video is sponsored by Audible. So, Fede Alvarez is one of those filmmakers who I thought was potentially going to be the next big thing in horror after showing a hell of a lot of promise with his Evil Dead remake under the mentorship of Sam Raimi. However, instead of it becoming his calling card to produce his own creative projects, like many young promising filmmakers who gain the interest of a major studio, he became what you could call a subordinate to the Hollywood studio system. Like, he's got a really good, consistent working relationship with Sony Pictures, but that also means he's their bitch, so it somewhat feels like he's limited on the kinds of projects he can produce. It's not to say he sold his soul to the devil or anything, or like in the case of Josh Trank, got swallowed by the studio system. I would do the exact same thing if it meant consistent work, but ever since coming out with the acclaimed sleeper hit Don't Breathe in 2016, his projects are either making adaptations of this, remaking that, producing some niche Marvel property, or making a sequel to the one original film that proved he was a talented filmmaker and not just Sony's edgy adapting wildcard. Now, obviously, I'm just cynically speculating, I'm sure he's happy enough, yet I think we genuinely underestimate how much of a Hollywood anomaly Don't Breathe was at the time of its release. It wasn't just because it came during a time when the demand for new original properties was at an all-time high, following a decade of repetitive supernatural possession movies, Fede of which, having actually made one, a very good one at that, but because nobody expected Don't Breathe to be this major critical and commercial success that arguably dismantled the myth that it was near impossible to sell an extremely dark, niche, near exploitative style R-rated horror movie to a mainstream audience. If indeed, that's because they actually undersold what the film was about. Bear in mind, this was around the time that studios like A24 had only started making a name for themselves within the horror genre with more risky, unconventional flicks that are now practically everywhere today. I'm not saying Don't Breathe kickstarted a trend or anything, it just came out right as indie studios and streaming services were becoming more readily accessible to filmmakers to get these kinds of films off the ground, so for a major Hollywood studio to release something this different and provocative was a bolder move than many seem to realize, at least from the perspective that it was a movie that wasn't following any popular trends at the time. Since the film practically faded into obscurity since its release, I think it's worth revisiting just how a simple sleeper hit, which honestly wasn't doing anything special, managed to leave such a big impression at the wake of its release. So let's talk about it. Like I said, Don't Breathe wasn't anything game-changing. 2016 was an incredible year for original horror movies. In fact, I would argue the best horror film of the last decade came out of it. But for mainstream Hollywood studios, their output was still predominantly focused on trendy supernatural bullshit that either relied on the same generic formula or employed old gimmicks to create the illusion of originality. Don't Breathe, on the other hand, was actually harder to define when you think about it. If we're getting into the raw nitty-gritty of it, I guess it's technically a slasher movie, however, that is an oversimplification for a film that seemed more inspired by 70s exploitation rape revenge cinema, like The Last House on the Left or I Spit on Your Grave. I mean, you can easily pick out all the obvious Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees stuff and gush over its tension, dread, tension, but this is as far as the film comes to mainstream pop culture appeal, and where my snobby horror cinephile opinions begin to take over. I will say this, I do think the voyeuristic filmmaking is super clever at times, and I love how it plays with orientation to make such a small, intimate house feel like this complex labyrinth as the characters struggle to make sense of their confined setting. Yet, I also think this is a good example of a film that has what I call false tension. Far too often, we are way too forgiving of tension when it can be just as cheap as a forced-in jump scare. If it's not simply adding escalating violin music to justify prolonged scenes of nothingness and generate the illusion that something is happening, it's about being very selective with what defines that tension. This is especially prominent in any film that emphasizes a villain that depends on sound. In the case of Don't Breathe, 1 minute the blind man can hear the smallest, most piercingly specific sound, so that drawn-out, heart-beating, breath-holding tension is truly palpable, but then the next minute he can't hear jack shit when you're right next to him, so what that tells me is that there's no consistency to the rules of its logic, and those rules can be broken when the film needs to force in some feeling of danger. I agree that it's a very nitpicky thing, yet, like I always say, when you're desensitized to films like this because you've seen so many like it, that tension does require a hefty payoff to make you feel genuinely uncomfortable. In fact, probably the biggest issue for me was how the film opens in the midst of things where the blind man drags our protagonist Rocky back to the house before showing us how we got there. You see, I get the point of this setup in a film noir where it's about building up a mystery that sometimes recontextualizes our understanding of the opening, but here it just doesn't work because not only does the story lack subversion when we finally come back to it, now I know when she eventually gets out of the house, she's just going to end up right back in it, so you've just lost any credible suspense in these later scenes. Anyway, with that aside, going back to its influence, that 70s era of taboo subject matter isn't something you'd expect to be marketed to a general audience because the extremely nihilistic, borderline mean-spirited morality play behind these kinds of films was traditionally a turn-off for audiences less accustomed to gritty, unapologetic horror. Probably the closest mainstream equivalent around the time was the Saw and Hostel series, yet their brief success stemmed from a very different reason, but that's a whole other can of worms I'll maybe open another day. The story follows 3 robbers from Detroit who attempt to rob the house of an unnamed war veteran who was blinded by a shrapnel grenade during his service, only to discover that his weakness is actually one of his greatest strengths, along with, you know, his actual strength. From there, they basically spend the majority of the runtime trying to escape the blind man's house as he hunts them down, only to throw in a casual wee plot twist where he's revealed to be this sadistic Joseph Fritzl-style motherfucker who has a woman captive in his basement. It's surprising that, in a day and age of spoiler-filled trailers, this mid-movie revelation managed to go completely unspoiled because the studio left it in the dark during its marketing, probably in the interest of not wanting to, ironically, scare off general audiences. After all, it's so twisted and nasty that I'm genuinely astounded Alfaraz even got away with it. I assume that's because it's handled as tastefully as rape via a turkey baster can be, but it's the idea itself that makes it so disturbing. The woman captive in the blind man's basement killed his daughter in a car accident, and because she was surrounded by wealth and power, she managed to get off the hook, so the blind man's version of justice, or revenge, is to impregnate her and have her give birth to a new child, to which, after doing so, he'll let her go free, as if that would ever happen. The thing is, it does make up the most interesting aspect of the film's entire conflict, even though it's ultimately weighed down by logic that is so fucking flawed that the more you think about it, the more it begins to fall apart. However, let me try and put it into a positive context. So, you could say there's this really thin thread of Lovecraftianism to the film, where the blind man essentially conveys both a figurative and literal meaning. After seeing the true horrors of war, the blind man lost part of himself in the process, that being both his sight and his sanity, and after returning home to the cesspit of despair known as Detroit, his daughter became his only beacon of hope and humanity. And then, after her death, he lost his only light left in this world, thus having no ability to see hope in a truly hopeless world. This is then reinforced by a duality between the blind man and our central protagonist Rocky. Rocky is kinda in a similar situation. Her entire motive for committing the robbery is so that she can escape this all-consuming evil underbelly of Detroit with her innocent sister, and find a new, better life elsewhere, something which becomes recurring with a very blatant ladybird symbolism, because of course it represents freedom and achieving one's goals and yada yada yada. Not to completely shit on Detroit, but there's definitely this oppressive, villainous energy to the setting that makes Rocky's sister stand out. She really is aesthetically the sole colourful beacon of light in the film, and as a result, it tries to get you to root behind Rocky's motive, despite how immoral it is. A lot of 70s exploitation used morality plays to challenge the audience's sensibilities by putting them in a position where there's no fairy tale hero or good versus bad dynamic. At the end of the day, these types of films were about human beings at their most primal and vulnerable. It took all these social constructions about morality and civility and threw them out the window to show us how we're still ultimately animals just trying to survive in this world. Some of these films even embedded criticisms towards class and the family structure, which Don't Breathe even hints at with its own class theme, where, on top of the blind man's reasoning for taking a woman captive due to the justice system favouring the rich, we're also in this vicious cycle of poverty and urban decay where desperate times call for desperate measures, and then you even have this whole middle class character Alex still being sucked into this life of crime that becomes part of this futile romance that was never going to be. But this is where my interpretation begins to shit the bed. I do think the film sincerely tries to add meaning to the madness, yet it becomes contradicted by a lot of other crap that the film tries to do. For one, by adding a personal development to the blind man, it makes him less enigmatic in the vein of Michael Myers, and in turn made me question how sympathetic I'm supposed to be for the guy, because while Stephen Lang does give genuine hints of a humanized performance, how am I meant to understand this guy when he's doing such extremely twisted things? Honestly, he works better as a pure brooding presence whose ability to hunt down the characters gives him a frighteningly mild supernatural quality, because the minute he begins trying to justify his actions, I started to check out. Like, late into the story, after accidentally killing the captive woman, the blind man then captures Rocky as a replacement and then proceeds to tell her that, "Oh, I'm not actually a rapist because I didn't technically stick my pee-pee in her." Yeah, well, you did stick a turkey baster in her, so that definitely counts for something. You should maybe look up the definition of rape again, or, well, get someone to read it to you. Anyway, I get the general idea behind the twist was to subvert who we were meant to be rooting for. At first it seems simple, like we side with the blind man because fuck these criminal scum, but then because he's doing something worse, which the film continually makes a point of, it sort of acts like that suddenly alleviates the criminals of their crimes? I don't see how that makes any sense. I mean, as totally smug and indulgent as it sounds, I think my analysis would hold more ground if the film had stuck to its original conclusion. Basically, the theatrical ending has Rocky escape with the money and leave Detroit with her sister, and you get your happily ever after. But the thing is, that goes against the philosophy of 70s exploitation, where there should be some sort of comeuppance to Rocky's actions. In the alternate ending, however, the blind man is shown to follow Rocky and her sister, alluding to the idea that he has unfinished business and so on. And the reason I prefer this, contrived logic aside, I mean, how does a blind man follow them? You know what I mean, is because of one really selfish move that Rocky makes that I think catalyzes everything that happens in the house. Let me explain. So, when the blind man kills the douchebag of the group, Alex decides to go back to help Rocky because he truly cares about her safety. But before they leave, Rocky still decides to rob the safe, and because of the specific attention drawn to it, I couldn't help but feel like it was meant to seal Alex's fate and foreshadow his impending death. I think he's the only character of real compassion in the story, and early in the film, it seems like Rocky is actually manipulating manipulating Alex into naively helping her under the guise that they have a companionship, which the douchebag of the group even points out, but Alex decides to ignore all the warnings because he still truly loves her. It made me feel less sympathetic of her character. Like, I know you want to get your sister away from an abusive household, but you're not exactly going the most redeemable way about it. The way I see it, Rocky desperately wants the money so bad that she's willing to drag Alex further into the problem, with Alex being the one to constantly find solutions to each predicament. He carries all the weight, his death is on her hands, but the film seems to completely disregard this idea. There's no redemption or bittersweet ending like Rocky sacrificing the money to survive, or getting arrested and her sister going into child protection services, or something like that. She just gets away scot-free, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. But I guess I will concede that it does kind of fit the 70s exploitation because morality is completely thrown aside, like I was saying earlier. Overall, what made Don't Breathe so impressive for its time was that, while I've seen dozens of films like it, you rarely see them from major studios like Sony, especially ones that garner such commercial success. Don't Breathe made a really strong case to see more morality plays that challenge notions of good and bad. It seems today people like to think the world really is that binary black and white, you're either good or bad, even though that's never been the case, so it's nice to see films, especially horror films, continue to challenge these mainstream sensibilities. Sure, at times the film lacked logical focus, but amidst it all, Don't Breathe was still a compelling plunge back into the dark abyss that current mainstream cinema constantly tries to look away from. Hey folks, thanks for watching. Since this is a film all about sound, it's only appropriate that this video be sponsored by Audible. Audible is the home to thousands of audiobooks and spoken word entertainment, ranging from bestsellers to podcasts to even business and self-development. Since I'm always on the move these days, and when in my car or on planes and so on, I started using Audible to catch up on some titles I've always wanted to read, and because I'm dyslexic, it does take me a considerably long time to get through a book, so it's nice to have a bit of leisure to just absorb myself into a story. I'm actually currently listening to The Outsider by Stephen King to coincide with the miniseries on HBO. It's an incredibly creepy little detective story about a shapeshifter, and for King, it's quite subtle and unique, and since I'm writing my own story at the minute, I'm finding it pretty inspiring in my writing process, so it's a big recommendation from me if you decide to give Audible a shot. Once that's over, I actually plan on checking out Bad Blood by John Carreyrou about the whole Theranos controversy. If you want to give Audible a test drive for yourself with a free 30-day trial, which includes 1 free audiobook and 2 free Audible originals, then visit audible.com/Hollinger, or if you're feeling old school about it, text Hollinger to 500-500 to get started. And if you already have Audible, why not just give some horror recommendations in the comments below. Anyway, until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!